Well, thank you very much for that wonderful welcome. Tell me, how many of you have been told at school that science has disproved God? Put your hands up. Probably about half of you. That's absolutely fascinating, because I want to tell you this morning that science not only has not disproved God, but science cannot disprove God. Indeed, it goes the other way around. I want to suggest to you very provocatively that science and God mix perfectly, but science and atheism do not. So let's have a look. You will see on the slide a debate I had with Richard Dawkins, who thinks that science and God do not mix. And below him sits Christopher Hitchens, looking rather unhappy, with whom I debated the same issue. You can see those debates on my website, johnlennox.org, and they're very useful for class discussion. What I want to suggest to you is this: it's very easy to see that science hasn't disproved God. Just look at those two Nobel Prize winners. On the left is Steven Weinberg, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics. He is an atheist. On the right is Charles Townes, who also won the Nobel Prize for Physics, and he was a Christian. Now, what divides those two men is not their science. They're both brilliant. They've both had the highest accolade that science can give them. So it's not science that divides them. What divides them is their worldview. Weinberg, an atheist, and Townes, a Christian. And I want to suggest to you that the real issue is not science versus God at all. It's atheism versus theism, in my case, Christianity, and there are scientists on both sides. So we're thinking about worldviews. On the one side, naturalism, or materialism as it's often called, it's atheistic. On the other side, theism. And roughly speaking, they give the following answers to some of the big questions. For the atheist, the universe is all that exists. For a Christian theist like me, the universe is not all that exists. There is a God who created it. For the naturalist, ultimate reality is mass energy, or the universe, or the multiverse. For the theist, ultimate reality is God, not the universe. And for the atheist, the universe has got to be able to explain itself from the bottom to the top. For the theist, the universe requires both kinds of explanation, bottom up and top down. And the atheist claims that the universe gives no evidence of God. I want to claim the universe gives a lot of evidence of God. Now, since the clash is between two worldviews, the real question to ask is, where does science fit? Does it point towards naturalistic atheism, or does it point towards theism? Some time ago, Stephen Hawking was asked what he thought of religion, and he said, religion is a fairy story for those afraid of the dark. And I was asked to comment on it, and I said, well, if you want a one-liner, I would like to suggest on the same basis that atheism is a fairy story for those afraid of the light. Now, don't laugh, because neither of those statements prove anything at all, actually. They're both statements by scientists. Hawking's a scientist, and I'm a kind of scientist. But we've got to realize that statements by scientists are not necessarily statements of science. When Hawking says religion is a fairy story for those afraid of the dark, he's simply saying what he believes. That is not a scientific statement. And we've got to ask, what's the evidence? And similarly to my statement. Now, evidence I've mentioned. I believe that science and God mix very well because of the evidence. And there are various kinds of evidence that I would like to briefly mention. The first one is the history of science. The second, the nature and philosophy of science. And the third one is results of science. Now, often the debate is phrased between science on the one side and faith on the other side. That is a very misleading idea. Why? Because every scientist is a person of faith. You cannot do science without believing that science can be done. That ought to be pretty obvious. In other words, you can't do science unless you believe that the human mind can access something about the nature of the universe. And C.S. Lewis, once commenting on this, said, men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law of nature, and they expected law of nature because they believed in a lawgiver. Now, this is very important because it's been almost totally forgotten. Modern science owes its origin to Christianity in Europe. And when we look at the meteoric explosion of modern science in the 16th and 17th centuries, we find that all the pioneers were believers in God. So we have Galileo, for instance, who said, I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended us to forgo their use. Secondly, Johannes Kepler said the chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order which has been imposed on it by God and which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics. And the greatest of them all, Sir Isaac Newton, don't doubt the Creator, he wrote, because it is inconceivable that accidents alone could be the controller of this universe. So Isaac Newton, the discoverer of the law of gravitation, believed in God and was driven partly to his faith in God because of his discoveries. Now here's the interesting thing. Fast forward to the 20th century and we find 21st century, actually. We find the Times quoting Stephen Hawking as saying God did not create the universe. Now, why is that interesting? Well, because Stephen Hawking, up until recently, held Isaac Newton's chair. So we've got this very odd situation to look at. Isaac Newton, discoverer of the law of gravitation, believed in God. Stephen Hawking, who occupied Newton's chair at Cambridge, uses gravity as a reason not to believe in God. So you can focus the whole debate and ask the question, how do we get from Newton to Hawking? Now let me first give you Hawking's reason for dismissing God. It's the central statement of his book, The Grand Design. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Now, that is a very interesting sentence. When I first saw it, I thought, come again? Because there is a law of gravity, because there is something, the universe can create itself from nothing. Flat contradiction number one. It's worse still. The universe will create itself. Well, if I say to you, X creates Y, that means roughly, if you've got X, you'll get Y, yes? If I say X creates X, that means that if you've got X, you'll get X. And what does that mean? Well, it means that nonsense remains nonsense, even if Hawking writes it. It is a sheerly nonsensical statement. Worse still, because there is a law of gravity. He doesn't say because gravity exists. And he's falling into a trap of thinking that laws can create things. But I'm sure you've learned at school that the law of gravitation doesn't create gravity. Laws simply describe what normally happens. Newton's laws of motion never moved a billiard ball in the history of the universe. People with cues do that. So there are 3 levels of self-contradiction in this statement. I do not find it convincing. So how do we get from Newton's theism to Hawking's atheism? I want to analyze this a bit, because these are arguments that anyone at school can understand. They're not complex, they're very simple. And I'm going to give you 2 or 3 of them. The first thing is that Hawking is confused about the nature of God. The second thing is he's confused about the nature of scientific explanation. So let's think about the nature of God. You've probably seen that famous cartoon of scientists at a blackboard, and it's filled with formulae on the left and formulae on the right, and to connect the two, someone has written, "Then a miracle occurs." And one of the scientists says to the other, "I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. Now, behind that lies a very false idea of the nature of God. The picture shows a Greek god. And Greek gods were invented to be explanations of what people did not understand. We call them gods of the gaps. Put it more crudely, I can't explain it, therefore God did it. You can't explain lightning, so you have a god of lightning. Go to a course in atmospheric physics and the god of lightning disappears. Now, listen very carefully to this. If you think God is like that, then of course you have to choose between science and God. If you define God to be the explanation for what science has not yet explained, then you have to choose between God and science as a matter of logic. Do you understand that? You've defined God to be what science has not yet explained. So you pitch them against each other. But no intelligent person I've ever met believes in a God like that. And certainly the God of the Bible is not a God of gaps. Genesis does not, I hope you've noticed this, Genesis does not begin with a statement, "In the beginning, God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand." No, it's "in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," the whole show. So he's not a God of the gaps. He created everything. So science, therefore, understanding how it works, is no threat to the God of the whole show. And that's backed up in the New Testament at the beginning of John's Gospel. "In the beginning was the Word. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be that came to be." Now, of course, that answers Dawkins' question, which he thinks gets rid of God completely. It's the main argument in the God delusion. If we believe that God created anything, then we must be able to ask who created God. And then we have to be able to ask who created the God that created the God that created the God that created the God, and so on, ad absurdum. So let's forget God, go back to something interesting like football or Justin Bieber. But just a moment. If you ask the question, I hope Saturday morning's a great morning for logic, isn't it? I mean, just think about it. You ask the question, who or what created God? Who or what created X? That is supposing that X is created. So if you say who created God, you're assuming God was created. But again, the Bible claims that God was not created. He is eternal. He didn't come to be. The universe came to be. And everything that came to be, he created it, so he hasn't created himself. In other words, Hawking's apparent knockdown question doesn't even address the issue, because it only refers to created gods. And you notice his book is not called The Created God Delusion, because if it were, nobody would have bought it. You see, what's essential here is to realize that this claim that it eliminates God does no such thing. because it simply shows that Hawking cannot believe in something that's eternal. And of course, that's a very different question. So this does not get rid of God at all, the eternal God of the Bible. And it's odd, particularly when I was in Russia, I used to meet many people who would ask me this question. And I would say to them, oh, so you cannot believe in anything eternal. Tell me about the universe. Oh, it's always been there. Oh, so it's eternal. So your problem is not with something eternal, but it's with an eternal person. Not many people believe that anymore, so we'll leave it. Now, come to the next thing. The nature of philosophy of science. I said that Hawking's making a mistake because of the nature of explanation. So let's ask, what do we mean by explanation? The law of gravitation. You've met it at school, I'm sure. If not, you will. And it's a wonderful law, but what does it explain? Now, let me tell you this. I went to school many centuries ago, and I thought that the law of gravitation explained gravitation, you know. I was an adult, well into midlife, before I realized that the law of gravitation doesn't explain gravitation. The law of gravitation is a most brilliant mathematical way of calculating what massive bodies do to one another and how they behave. But Newton himself realized it didn't tell us what gravitation was. Indeed, it was Ludwig Wittgenstein, a fascinating philosopher, who said this. I want you to note this. The great delusion of modernity is that the laws of nature explain the universe for us. The laws of nature describe the universe. They describe the regularities, but they explain nothing. What's that saying? It's saying we need to be very wary of the claim science explains. Or the law of gravitation is all you need to know about gravity. It isn't. No one today knows what gravity is. There are so many basic things we learn about in school, and no one yet knows what they are, like gravity, energy, and so on. Let me illustrate this another way, which I find is usually simple enough for professors to understand. And it's this. Why is the water boiling? Well, it's boiling because the heat from the Bunsen burner is being conducted through the copper base of the kettle, and that's agitating the molecules of water, and they're moving faster and faster. That's why it's boiling. No, it isn't. It's boiling because I want a cup of coffee. Well, why are you laughing? Well, because I'm talking nonsense. Can you not see, I'm sure you can, that both of these explanations are necessary? It is boiling for the physics reasons I've given you. It's also boiling because I want a cup of coffee. But those two explanations are of different kinds. One is an explanation in terms of laws and mechanisms and physics. The other is an explanation in terms of personal agency. I want a cup of coffee. So we notice that both of them are necessary, but they do not conflict. They complement one another. And indeed, the personal explanation is generally more important than the scientific. People have been drinking tea for centuries before they discovered the basic laws of heat. So this is a very important thing. Now let's apply it very simply. Newton's law of gravitation no more competes with God as an explanation of the universe than the law of internal combustion competes with Henry Ford as an explanation for the motor car. It's so obvious. I have never met a young person that hasn't understood that argument. I've met many professors that don't seem to understand it. They think that the scientific explanation is the only one. So what am I saying? I'm saying to you that science is brilliant. It gives us explanations, but only at a certain level. It doesn't deal with the why questions, the ultimate purpose questions. And Richard Swinburne, one of my colleagues at Oxford, has put it this way: I do not deny that science explains, but I postulate God to explain why science explains. The very success of science in showing us how deeply orderly the natural world is provides strong grounds for believing there is an even deeper cause for that order. But I want to say a little bit more about the nature of explanation, because we're often told that only explanation is meaningful if it goes from the simple to the complex. And Dawkins has built this into his book as well. He says, using God as an explanation is absurd, since God is by definition more complex than the thing you're explaining. To which I replied, and I said, that's very interesting. I pick up a book, it's called The God Delusion. It's quite complex. It's 400 pages long, and it's got lots of words. It's very complicated. So I asked for its origin, and somebody suggests to me absurdly that it originates in the infinitely more complex mind of Richard Dawkins. And I say, well, that's impossible, because your explanation is more complex than the thing you're explaining. It is a silly argument, but it's very important to see what lies behind it. It's wonderful when we can explain complicated things in terms of simple things. But there's one place you can never do it, and that is where language is involved. The moment you see language, you're looking at language on the screen behind you, you instantly recognize that no matter how sophisticated the machinery, the processes behind that projection are, there's a mind behind it. My mind, actually. You see? Language tells you there's a mind behind it. And sometimes I test scientists. On several occasions, a scientist has said to me, well, I don't believe in God, of course. I'm a reductionist. I believe everything can be explained completely in terms of physics and chemistry, and that's it. So I hand them a dinner menu. And I say, well, there's a problem, isn't there? No, there isn't. It says asparagus soup, roast chicken, etc. Oh, I said, there is a problem. You believe that everything can be explained in terms of physics and chemistry alone? Yes. Well, okay. You explain to me the way in which ROAST carries meaning. Those symbols carry meaning in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. And on one occasion, this very brilliant scientist at Oxford, who's world famous, his wife was beside him, and she rather too loudly said, "Get out of that if you can." He didn't try. He said something that still rings in my ears. He said, you know, I have for 40 years gone into my laboratory in Oxford thinking that could be done, but it obviously can't. Once you see language, it brings into play mind. And then he asked me where I got the argument, because it was pretty obvious I was too dim to think of it for myself. So I said I got it from a Nobel Prize winner. The meaning of the message will not be found in the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. If that's true of roast chicken, what are we going to say about this? This is a word, the human genome, with 3.5 billion letters in exactly the right place. And the very same man that said there must be a mind behind the menu doesn't believe there's a mind behind that. I find that quite curious. What is going on? Well, I'll tell you what's going on. If naturalism, atheism is true, you've got to be able to explain this word solely in terms of physics and chemistry. But it's not possible. And there are lots of arguments in that direction. And if you want to have a look at some of my writings, you can find them. But I want to conclude just to indicate something else, because I'm a mathematician. Let's think a little bit more about thinking. Things like this. Einstein's famous equation, which no doubt you all know. No, you don't, not yet. Einstein could see that there was a problem. How is it we can use mathematics to understand the universe? Eugene Wigner was a Nobel Prize winner, and he said the enormous usefulness of mathematics is something border on the mysterious. There is no rational explanation of it. The miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics For the formulation of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. How is it that mathematics works? I'm thinking in my head, come up with equations, and they seem to apply to the universe. My teacher of quantum physics, John Polkinghorne, says physics can't explain that. And sometimes I ask people, in fact I frequently do it these days, what do you do science with? And they described some machine. I said, I don't mean that, I mean, oh, you mean my, they're about to say mind when they remember that there's no such thing as the mind for sophisticated people these days. So they say the brain. I said, okay, I do believe in the mind, but you do science with your brain. Okay, we'll accept that for a minute. Tell me about the brain. Tell me the story of the brain. Short story? Yes. Well, the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I just look at them and smile and said, and you trust it? And you trust it? If your computer, you knew, was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, you wouldn't use it for a moment. And then I say this, do you know where I got that argument from? Charles Darwin. And some people are a bit surprised. With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Now, this argument is very important. Darwin saw it. C.S. Lewis saw it, and it's beginning to move into the center of the whole debate. Because, you see, modern humanism, this is an atheist writing, John Gray, is the faith that through science humankind can know the truth and so be free. But if Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, this is impossible. The human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. Secondly, Alvin Plantinga, one of the world's top philosophers, says, if Dawkins is right, that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including Dawkins' own atheism. But the bombshell came with a book by Thomas Nagel. There's the title of it, up at the top. Why the Neo-Darwinian view of the world is almost certainly false. And what he says is this, and it goes back to my menu illustration. If, as many atheists have to believe, the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. In other words, my conclusion is this, that atheism ultimately undermines the very validity of the rationality we need, not only for science, but any thinking whatsoever. Or, to put it another way, do science and God mix? Yes, very well. But science and atheism do not mix, because atheism logically leads to doubt about the validity of the rational processes needed to do science. In every one of the 10 trillion cells in our body, there is a word. Could it be a word that points to the existence of the creative word? In the beginning was the Word. Thank you very much.